Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to everyone joining us for this webinar today from literally different parts of the globe. I hope all of you can hear me all right. I'd love a thumbs up or a yes in the chat. My name is Isha, and I'll be the moderator for today's session for all of you. Perfect. Thank you. Some quick housekeeping announcements before we get into the actual discussion for today. So all attendees will be on mute by default. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat window or post them in the Q&A panel. We'll make sure we address them during the session, or if for any reason we can't get back to you during the session, we'll get back to you on your registered email address. Please also make a note that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording would be made available to everybody who's registered in a few days from now. You'll also get a survey link after this session to share your feedback. We'd really appreciate if you could take that survey for a few seconds and share your feedback with us. And now, before I proceed to introduce our speakers for today, a little bit about Upside Learning. Could we move to the next slide, please? I'll tell you a little bit about who we are, just in case you don't know much about us. So we are a leading provider of custom learning content for enterprises across the globe. We've been into business for more than 19 years now, have worked with 200 plus clients, and we've been bestowed with 100 plus accolades so far and still counting. As a business, our focus is essentially on helping L&D professionals deliver learning that just doesn't look good, but actually works in terms of achieving learning and business outcomes. And with that, it's time for me to introduce our fabulous speaker duo for today. So we have Amit Garg, the founder and CEO of Upside Learning. Amit comes with over 19 years of experience in consulting organizations around the world on resolving business challenges through learning solutions. He's done that for long. He's an avid reader and keeps sharing his insights and findings regularly with the learning community through his LinkedIn handle, which I'll share over chat shortly in case you would like to follow him. Amit is being joined by none other than Quinn. Most of you may already know Clark. He's Upside's Chief Learning Strategist and the Executive Director of Quinn. Clark has been involved in the design, development, and evaluation of a wide variety of educational technology for more than 40 years now. He's authored multiple books on learning. He also holds the honor of being awarded as eLearning Guild's first Guild Master in 2012. And now with these powerful introductions, no further ado, I'll have Clark take over. Clark, over to you.
Thank you very much, Isha. Greatly appreciated. And a welcome to my co-presenter, Amit. Thank you for joining us. And thank you all for joining us today. I think this really needs no explanation. I think it just indicates the challenge we face, that there's a lot of confusion about what microlearning might really be. And people may not think they're confused, but from a conceptual point of view, we have some challenges. And that's what we're talking about today. We're trying to help make clear what we think microlearning can and should be and how to do it. And in fact, we'll not only talk about it conceptually, we'll also work through a couple case studies. I want to ask you to start. What do you think microlearning is? And if you would please use the chat, just top in, it doesn't have to be an essay, just a quick phrase or a description that you think what microlearning really is. Masya says bite-sized, okay. Chunked up learning, okay. Bite-sized trainings, 5 minutes or less, a small piece of big learning, small bite size over a period of time, chunking, small learning, single objectives, small modules, bite-sized content, breaking up into small forms, small one task event, single task, single objective. So some of it's about a single objective, some of it's about small chunks. Right time, right place, one objective. Interesting part. So indeed, we have heard pretty much all of these. Allowing to apply the knowledge immediately, yes. So we're unpacking some different concepts. And what we want to do is figure out which of these make sense, when do they make sense, how do they make sense? And the point is none of these are wrong. The question is, do we really understand the nuances and the distinctions? Jesse says, can fit into the workflow without too much interruption. Interesting issue. So for us, microlearning is about performance. Okay, yes, we're paying a small little bait and switch here. We'll get into those definitions, but for us, you shouldn't be doing microlearning unless you really have some outcome you're trying to achieve. And then you want to match the solution to that outcome you're trying to achieve. And that's really important focus to make microlearning work. So when you hear about microlearning, I've tended to hear about it in a couple different ways. So one, it's like YouTube. You look up a video and figure out how to do something. I myself have done that. I had a broken dryer. I looked up a YouTube and I managed to solve it to fix my dryer. That was years ago. No idea what happened. But we will, that's one of the interpretations of microlearning. And will this presentation be available to view later, Michael? Yes, as Isha said, it will be available to everybody who registered. Another one that a number of you mentioned is it's about course bits. It's about course broken up into small chunks. I want to unpack these nuances a touch. So when you talk about the YouTube situation, that just the little chunk you need at the time you need it, that is not a just-in-case solution. It is not about learning. It is about just-in-time help in the moment. And that's great. Absolutely. When I fixed my dryer that way, it got fixed. That's all I really cared about. By the way, we have a name for that. That tends to be performance support. It was a job aid. It was a little video that showed me how to do the procedure. I can't remember if I did the diagnosis before accessing the video, or if the video included the diagnosis. There's an interesting message there. I don't remember. I didn't learn anything. I can barely remember where on the dryer it was. I don't remember what the problem was. I don't remember how I fixed it, but I did. And that's what's important here, is about performance. I got the job done. I didn't have to learn. Now, when we talk about the other side, it's about course bits. Too often people think about it's about breaking a course up into chunks. Yes, and it's not about just taking it and breaking it up into chunks. To space learning out, you really need to know when to reactivate the same thing and when to introduce something new. Because you typically don't have very many goals that are just small, little, learn this right now. You have a do this right now, or you need to learn a new skill. And therefore, learning a new skill tends to have steps. You first acquire this part of it and this part of it, and you learn to put it together, and eventually you can do the whole task. Knowing how to break that up means if you just take your ordinary course, particularly if there are typical bad courses to begin with, breaking them up in little chunks will only perhaps make learners like consuming it more, but it isn't necessarily going to lead to any persistent outcome. And yet that's what we should be concerned with when we're worried about spaced learning, because that's what this is. It's spaced learning. And spaced learning and performance support are both valuable things. They're also very different in what it takes to do them right. So it's not just breaking up courses. It is not just keeping things to less than X minutes. I think that video was several minutes long. That was okay, my dryer one. But instead, it's about either spacing learning out appropriately to lead to a persistent new ability to do, retention over time, and transfer to all appropriate situations and no inappropriate ones, or helping people in the moment. Both of those are valuable. Both of those take small chunks of content, but they have very different outcomes and goals. And when people say microlearning, they often mean either one of those, without distinguishing between them. And it's really important to distinguish between them. And if somebody just says, oh, we'll throw microlearning at it without being clear about which one, you should be very afraid. So it helps to be clear. It helps to recognize when spacing out courses makes sense and when in the moment help makes sense. So it's not just breaking up courses or keeping things to less than X minutes, it's spacing learning or performance support. By the way, performance support, people talk about workflow learning. And that is the notion that I can learn in the workflow. There's a problem with that. Learning takes time to stop and reflect and make experiments to support learning. You literally have to break the workflow to actually have learning happen. So in most instances, when people talk about workflow learning, they're really talking about performance support. Just to be clear, and this session isn't about workflow learning, but we wanted to be clear that there is a notion of workflow learning. Yes, thanks, Vini. Yes, being told to break up a course and make microlearning is a common thing. Vendors are told to do that, and internal groups are told to do that. That's why we're having this session, to help unpack what really matters. So now, how do you know which microlearning to use? How do you know when you should use in the moment support and when you should actually develop spaced learning? When should you use microlearning in each format? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I had a quick question for you. And first of all, hello everyone. I'm glad that you are joining us today. I didn't get an opportunity to say hello earlier, so here it is. But Clark, you said microlearning is probably a more marketing-ish, more fancy name for spaced learning or performance support. And spaced learning seems to be one of the default methods by which learning happens, the way our brains learn. So should microlearning become a default method when it is not being used as performance support, as a default method for spaced learning to support that spaced learning fundamentals? Or put it another way, are there reasons or situations where you should not use microlearning? If you want to share something on that.
Sorry. So I'll repeat the question for folks, Amit. Maybe you can boost your volume a little bit because you seemed a bit soft to me as well in volume. What he was asking is there, if microlearning, when it's spaced learning, is the default for formal learning, is there a time when we should not use it? And my answer is that when you always probably need spaced learning, our brain architecture requires it, but when you need really deep dealing with complex problems, you may need some initial intervention that is substantive enough to give a foundation for which spaced learning to operate on top of. So you may need an intensive situation. If you really need a rapid development of capability, you might use a concerted period of time to give the foundation. You still need spacing to reinforce it, but if it's going to be used a lot in the real world, you may not need to space learning, because that space learning will happen and should happen through coaching, not through an artificial microlearning solution. And I don't mean microlearning is artificial in a bad sense. I just mean you can use microlearning in a sense of delivering more to reactivate and regenerate learning if it doesn't happen a lot frequently in the real world. If it happens a lot frequently in the real world, just put coaching out there. But microlearning is a good solution when it doesn't happen a lot in the real world, and you want to have the time to develop that capability, and you want to make sure it's there. So that, when you need performance support, the minimum performance support in the moment is great. When you need spaced learning, make sure that it's building, you have the time frame to do that slow build. you will still need even intensive, but it might be an intensive 4 days of practice. And each day you're revisiting the initial stuff and maybe expanding it, as opposed to a microlearning spaced out over a number of weeks.
Excellent.
So,
thank you. Are you able to hear me better now?
You're still quiet. I don't know why that is.
Okay. Does this help?
I'll let the audience answer.
I just added a different mic. Okay. I hope it is better now.
All right.
Okay.
Excellent.
Thank you so much, Garg, for that.
Yeah. So back to the question, how do you know which microlearning? If you would pop your, Kathy says it's still garbled. So Raymond Wheeler says desired objectives. Yes. What are the objectives you're trying to achieve may determine when you might use performance support versus spaced learning. So if it's, are there any, I'm hoping some more you were going to weigh in again on this question. How do you know which microlearning? Time, frequency of performed tasks, safety. Yes, Jesse. One of the criteria for spacing is how important it is, how complex it is inherently, and how frequently you perform it afterwards. Just in time, Beth Ann, yes, just in time is an indicator of perhaps performance support. Learner context will absolutely have an interest, Patrick's. The frequency of task performance, yes, Richard. Spaced for knowledge retention, performance support if there's an identified performance problem. That's a good way to look at it. Pull versus push. Yeah, Lorraine, indeed. People can ask for help in the moment, suggesting performance support, versus push is when we want to develop some capability, and spaced learning is a good tool to suggest we need a more sustained ability to do differently. Location, the situation, complexity, importance, and frequency determines the amount of spacing required. Yes, exactly, Heidi. How big a behavior change is required? Yep, that can be indicative too. So accessibility of job aids and tech. I work in L&D and forestry, and my learners don't have computers on site. Then you, two things there, Jesse. One, I would, yes, Jesse, I would suggest two things. One is having computers on site is increasingly not a challenge because we have mobile devices and even, of a variety of types, wearables, watches, or pocketables. But yes, also if it can't be in the moment, it has to be in the head. That's another indicator of when to use spaced learning. So our answer is knowing which microlearning comes down to your analysis of the situation. Knowing when has to do with asking a series of questions to make sure you understand the situation. First of all, is it important? Because if it isn't, ignore it. Too often we throw solutions at problems. Somebody comes and says, I need a course on X, and we do X, or we need something, and it's not really the issue, and it's not important. But if it is important, then we need to ask, could they do it if, for instance, if a gun was held to their head? Sorry to use such a violent image, but can they do it? If they can, it's not an L&D problem. If they could do it, but they're not, we're talking about the wrong incentives, the wrong communications, the wrong culture. These are things not necessarily L&D's problem. Now, if they can't do it, the question is, can you put it in the world? In my estimation, it's far easier to put the answer in the world with performance support and not try and put it in the head. It's really hard to get things reliably in the head when you do it. So can you put it in the world? If you can, performance support, the microlearning that's just in time. We'll talk a little bit about what that means in a bit. Now, if you can't put it in the world, could they do it before and they can't do it now? Because if the answer to that is yes, we just need spaced practice to regenerate their ability to do. They have the concept, they just have forgotten how to do it. Let's give them practice. That's a great opportunity for microlearning, to provide little practices spaced out over time to reactivate that ability to do. If they couldn't do it before, this is really a new skill shift. It's training, which should include likely spaced learning, except in those times, as Amit was asking, when don't you use microlearning, when you really need a significant skill shift in a very short period of time. But we typically helps to reactivate that if they don't have an opportunity to perform. I like to use the situation of airline pilots. They train regularly for situations I hope never to face. But if they face it, it's really important, an emergency. So they train on things they hope never actually happens. So the real issue here is you definitely want micro-learning as spaced learning after some initial thing. In many cases, it makes a lot of sense. So, but performance sport, if you can, use spaced learning if you have to. So the next question, and you should be getting the gig here, use the chat. How do you do micro-learning right? How do you, if you're doing micro-learning, how to make sure you're getting the nuances right for either type? How do you convince leadership that they need to train like pilots? Jamie, they may not need to. They may not need to. You know, if the consequence of their decision or things take a little longer, cost a little more, is it really worth training like pilots with incredibly realistic simulators and huge amounts of time dedicated to this? Maybe not. They do. Okay. In certain circumstances, there's crisis. Leadership actually is complex. When I listen to people who I think actually have thought about it, there's the tame situation, which is really management. You know, you just have to execute a known process. There's crises where you need to make a quick decision as opposed to really leadership building consensus. And then there are wicked problems when you need to analyze it and bring people together and do things. And there's different types of leadership, and only one of those really may require, the crisis one may require that quick decision. So people are saying, make a 3-minute or less video. Yeah, per management request. Match to objectives, high risk decisions being made all the time, opportunities for practice and feedback. Yes, that particularly for spaced learning, Lorraine, you absolutely want to have practice and feedback for learning to occur. We can, you know, you can go out and do it, but your assessment of what was right and wrong may not be accurate, and it may take a number of failures before you figure out what's really going on. Providing that feedback in the moment has a much higher likelihood of accelerating the learning solution. What is lost if a company focuses too much on asynchronous microlearning culturally? Social learning demonstrates shared vulnerability, increasing psychological safety on teams. There is a benefit to building psychological safety and building a team mentality. Microlearning can be small group activities done spaced over time to build that. Although that's more complex and requires more coordination because you have to get people synchronously together at regular intervals. But that's not typical interpretation of microlearning. Getting microlearning right, task, user, situation analysis, but clearly understanding required outcome. Yeah, Kathy, that's right. Have learning outcomes at every step. Yes, for spaced learning in particular, but for performance outcomes, have performance outcomes at every step. And in fact, I like to talk about performance outcomes, not learning outcomes. Learning outcomes are steps on the way to performance outcomes. Start with your performance outcomes, work backwards. We'll talk about that. Performance support, it gives tools and examples, right? So I'm going to keep moving ahead in the interest of time and say doing microlearning right is about your design process and knowing the design nuances for each of the solutions. So in basic design, you analyze a situation, which we talked about, you specify a potential solution, you implement it, and you evaluate it and fine tune. Ideally, if you look at interface design and a number of other process design, and increasingly we're hearing people like Megan Torrance's Llama and Michael Allen Sam, they're talking about tight iterations, several cycles of it to get it right. That may not always be possible in your solution, but you should expect that you'll at least have to develop an initial one, test it, and add some refinements, because our cognitive architecture is not simple, and a simple solution isn't always going to create the right one. We have great principles to give us an initial design, but you'll still have to test it and fine tune it, is my recommendation. Now, for spaced learning design, spacing, the typical practice we see is this massed practice. And we actually will do pretty well on a test when we do that practice. But the problem is with that mass practice is we have a very rapid forgetting curve. I like to joke this was your college experience, right? Study for the night before the test, pass the test. 5 days later, you have no idea what you learned. We know that if we space out learning, we may not do quite as well on a test. We do well, don't get me wrong, but it's there much longer. And that's one of the benefits of microlearning. People ask, how much spacing do we need? How much practice do we need? And the answer, of course, is it depends. As I've suggested already, it depends on how important it is if you get it wrong, how complex it is inherently, how frequently you practice after learning experience. But we have some pretty good guidelines about what to do when. And if we reactivate it over time, particularly for things that don't happen very frequently, if we reactivate it, we make sure that there's a high likelihood it'll still be there when we need it. And again, this is the real purpose for microlearning in the spaced learning mode. So I want to hand over to Amit here to talk about a case study in spaced learning that Upside developed to illustrate what we're talking about.
Thanks, Clark. Are you able to hear me all right? Sorry, will you say yes?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. All right, so this is a quick bit from Towards Maturity 2019 survey. Very interestingly, they found that a significant proportion of our people very clearly said that they don't follow or they don't apply what they learn in a mandatory course. And that was something that probably some L&D teams already knew, but it just brought it out in the open. For us, we encountered a very similar situation while we were working on a project which was a mandatory course or compliance training for a global airline on slip, trips, and falls. So I will just check the chat if it's okay. Okay. And they had luckily had some internal survey that was done right at that time, which actually said very similar things. Some of their people said they don't follow what is being taught in their compliance training because their managers don't do that. And that was a big red flag in terms of what we were planning to do. And we realized that it's more of a cultural problem rather than a knowledge problem. Clark, if we can go to the next slide. Yeah, thank you. So what we designed was more of a safety campaign. We titled it as Lead by Example. It was scheduled to run for about 6 months. And then, after that, a little bit in terms of commitment and maintenance. But essentially, it had 4 key phases. Awareness for 1 month, where we get people to just, understand what is the challenge we're facing, get into motivation after that, where we highlighted why it was important to lead by example and follow all of those safety procedures. In the preparation phase, we gave all of the information that was required for them to act in the manner that they were being requested to or they should have. And then in demonstration, we actually capped the campaign in terms of collecting feedback and stories of how people actually went through that. The interesting thing here is almost all of these elements were very short. Very few of the elements within preparation stage were maybe more than 30 minutes. So some programs were included in preparation stage. If you dive deeper into phase 1, you would see there are 6 department specific, elements. Then we have a few posters that were sent out, which were like weekly, and we had some QR code enabled uh, videos that again gave them that awareness. All of these elements fit into the microlearning category. So where we used it was essentially to create you won't say a spaced learning program, but a spaced campaign. And each of those elements essentially qualified for being in microlearning category. We don't have exact output to share here, but it is just a representation of how we had visualized the stakeholder videos to be shared in their lobby areas, probably on their intranet as well. And for people who were remote and would not have access to everything, it would go out even on mails. The next one, and this is an example of posters that we would put up in the awareness stage. So that was one of the programs where we leveraged spaced effect through microlearning.
Thanks for that, Amit. The other type of microlearning, performance support, has totally different design parameters that are equally important, but very different. It turns out our cognitive architecture, as wonderful as it is, allowing us to create solutions that let me be speaking to you with Amit from opposite ends of the world, and yet no one architecture is perfect. And so we have certain limitations that can indicate the need for solutions. And we have developed lots of solutions for specific types of limits of our architecture. These are, and so we have checklists and lookup tables and decision trees and a bunch of tools we use. Our analysis should tell us what the particular gap in our performance is and how do we meet that. And then we have different design processes for each of these, but they're not complex. We just have to design an appropriate solution for the situation that helps us overcome the limitations. And so that with that support, and it may be a static resource, it may be a dynamic resource, together our ability to solve the problem is richer than it would be without that support. And again, we have a case study for Amit to help discuss what Upside did in a particular instance.
Thanks, John. So this is our client called Zangro, which is one of the leading suppliers for facilities cleaning agents. And the challenge that they were facing was of task rotation due to absence and other reasons. They wanted to improve immediate support for the replacement staff. Two critical facts that influenced the design for our solution was, one, they had a large portfolio of products, making it difficult for users to remember how to use each of them, especially the infrequent ones. And also, if there were new joinees and they were just kind of getting used to it, learning some of the products one by one. And second, most of the users, the cleaners, were actually, not having English as a strong area. English was their second language. Most of them were immigrants from different countries. So otherwise they would have been able to read the instructions at the back of the bottle, which were usually in fine print, making it even more difficult. So the solution that we created for them was printing a QR code, a unique QR code for each cleaning agent at the back of the bottle. And the cleaners could quickly scan that using their phones and get a 1 to 2 minute video, maximum 2 minutes, on how to use that. And that was quite clever. It worked very well. It just solved their problem in the most effective manner. We have a short video that we can play for you. Take a look at that. This is for 45 seconds, I guess. There's no audio, I guess.
Any sort of cleaning, ensure that you put on the correct personal protective equipment.
There is audio. If you can increase the audio.
Begin by placing safety signs around the work area. Spray the product directly onto affected area. Allow liquid to penetrate. Wait for 5 minutes. Absorb the stain out by blotting with white paper or extract with a machine. When finished, remove the safety signs.
Excellent. Yeah. So that's it. I think it was a short and sweet solution, but absolutely perfect for the need that the client had.
I think that was a perfect solution. The issue was they wouldn't know, there were too many products. They wouldn't know necessarily recall the procedure, even if they'd ever been exposed to it. They might not be. This showed them what to do, talked them through what to do, and had text about what to do. There was a multitude of ways, increase the likelihood that they would get the right, use it appropriately, solve the problem, get it clean. Sorry. Okay. You've developed it. I've suggested the iterative design process. And this was Kathy's question in the chat. How do you test microlearning? So if again, this is, please use the chat. But let us know, how do you test microlearning? Once you've developed it, performance support or space learning, how do you decide that it's working? On a small group first. Yeah, pilots are strongly recommended before you put it in place, pilot it. Observation of task performance. So, right, absolutely. Has it changed what they're doing? So you can observe the outcome. That is one very good piece of evidence that and you can do that at 2 points. You can do it after whatever intervention you've done, or you can do it after some period of time and see if it's actually going to the workplace. Do knowledge tests with pre and post microlearning content. Yeah, you can test the knowledge beforehand. A small problem with pre and post test, you expect an improvement, but that is okay in this instance. And, in research, it's problematic, but in the real world, I talk about statistical significance and business significance is important. Tried to use Kirkpatrick's at the 4 levels, not just testing after the first learning event. Absolutely, Kathy. I think that's, we know that that's the right solution. I'm not seeing it. Okay, Kirkpatrick, reaction learning behavior results. Get clear on your measure of success beforehand. Absolutely, Lorraine. That's a critical element. To know what you're trying, how will you know that it's successful unless you've determined beforehand what you're trying to achieve? Get 360-degree back from the stakeholder. That's another good piece of data. So it's not just observation internally, but are there other independent observers who might have be able to give you feedback? Consistency and pace of completion by the users. Yeah. So for us, testing microlearning is evaluation, right? And so as Kathy's suggesting, Kirkpatrick is a good framework. As I suggest at the beginning, it's about performance. What's the impact problem you originally had that tells you need a solution? You should say, hey, our sales are taking too long to complete, or, hey, we have too many errors in our manufacturing process, or, hey, our customers are dissatisfied with the response they're getting to our support mechanism. Whatever it is, you have a first problem. And you say, what measure tells us that it's wrong and will tell us that it's fixed? And we want to evaluate that and say, have we raised customer satisfaction ratings? Have we removed error? Have we decreased time to close sales? And then you say, what would people be doing differently in the workplace that would make that change? What are they doing now and what they should be doing differently that would address that problem? And you say, are they now doing it? And you don't ask that yet. You say, what would they be doing? And so what do they need to be able to do? And here's where you say, is this a situation where if I put information in the world, they'll be able to perform successfully? Or do I need to raise their skill level to be able to do something new that they don't know how to do now? These two the business impact and workplace behavior, give you your objective. And that was mentioned in one of the chat responses. Know your objectives that you're trying to achieve. Design a solution that is going to affect that. And then you do that intervention based on that design. And that intervention can be performance support, or it can be spaced learning, depending on the objective, depending on the change you need. By the way, you can also ask, did the users think it's important? In general, that doesn't help. But when we're talking about learning experience design and we want it to be a good experience because that leads to better comprehension, retention, and transfer, we may want to assess that as well. But then we work backwards. Did they like it? Did it lead to improved performance after the test? Then does it lead to sustained change in the behavior in the workplace? And then finally, you assess, did that then actually make a move the needle on the measure we're determining, told us it was wrong, and will tell us when it's right? This is, as Kathy points out, the Kirkpatrick approach. And for all its flaws, it actually is useful to focus on working backwards. And Kirkpatrick himself said he probably numbered it wrong. So that because you should start with the business impact, as I suggested here. By the end of the learning session module, the participant will be able to punch them as showing, yes, that's the important part for 2. But then the third thing, the next step up is, are they at the end of the learning session, the participant will be able to, but then in the workplace, the participant is. And then finally, the participant is, and that's leading to the change we need to have happen. Should not be a training intervention. It could be a training intervention if that's what needs. If they need a new skill shift, if you're introducing a new selling process, it may be training. If they need help in the moment, but just because of this gap, like Atul Gawande did with his checklist he found in surgery, they performed some things several times a day. And by this time, they couldn't remember or not if they'd done that step for this one because they'd done it for these previous ones. And they sort of thought they'd recalled that they'd done it, and they hadn't. And that's why he created a checklist that supported it. So there are times when performance support is the best solution. There are times when training is the best solution. We should be able to show how our learning events are tied to change. Yes, exactly, Kathy. That's the goal. So, and at this point, I want to hand back to Amit for the closing to summarize what we've talked about today. Except I think he's frozen.
Thanks, Clark. Can you hear me? It's like that kind of a session where the internet keeps troubling me today. Okay, thank you so much. Yes, so we've come to the end of what we had to share. And of course, we are open for questions after this. Let me quickly summarize this. What we discussed today is microlearning is performance support or space learning, or sometimes even both. We need to get it right. And for that, we should be looking at analysis, design, evaluation, all of those. While it looks easy, I think implementing microlearning with all that we have discussed today may sometimes be a bit of a challenge. So if you are looking for help, I think we can provide that support. And if you want to do, maybe a consulting session with Clark, we are offering a few complimentary ones. You can reach out to us at that email ID, or you can indicate in your survey feedback that will come to you after this. It will take you just about 2 minutes, but we really like to have your feedback to help us improve on our sessions in future. With that little bit of marketing, we are open to questions.
While we're waiting for you to potentially type in any questions you have, issues, concerns, thoughts, I'll mention, thank you very much for attending. And I hope what we said made sense, clarified microlearning, gave you some ideas and some direction for your own initiatives. Yeah, type and content and spacing is very important for success in the spaced learning, yes. And for the type of content, at least for the performance support. Also note that performance support largely is pull. People can ask for it. There are some smart ways you can actually do push with performance support or make it available in the moment. Those are all good solutions to go along with the importance of designing, recognizing the opportunity for performance support and designing it appropriately. What what time is microlearning? I'm not quite sure I understand the question, Timothy.
Maybe it's about the duration.
Yeah. Yes, Punch, and the video will be available. Isha has suggested it will be made available to all registrants. How would you use microlearning to reinforce previous training as a memory boost? Susan, yes. There are a number of ways of reactivating learning. You could present a concept in a different way as a way to help think about it anew. You can present a new example that shows it in practice that's not one they've seen before. You can actually give them challenges to apply it, whether it's little quizzes or not. You can ask them for reflections, what it's meant to them, sort of an open short answer thing. You can ask them to talk about how they're using it or what challenges they have. There's a lot of ways to reactivate this learning, and you should, I think, Kathy, or Susan, sorry, I think you should be thinking about reinforcing previous learning. Timothy asks, how long is microlearning? Back to the question about spacing, the issue is, there's two issues. How long in between for spacing, and that depends on how complex it is and how important it is and how frequently it happens in the real world. But if you're asking how long a chunk should be, that I like JD, why am I blanking on his surname? His response is as long as it needs to be. So we do know that short chunks work better. There's some evidence that people's attention wanes after about 6 minutes of a video. But if it's not a video, it depends. It should be as short as it can be and no shorter. We do tend to overwrite. I can cut 40 to 60% out of most content, including my own. I have to take 2 passes. But there is no one answer to that question. Jesse asks, with microlearning having the fuzzing definition and being the hot jargon for organizations currently, do you think it is just a current L&D trend or will it be longstanding? I think the notion of going short is going to persist. I think being clear about whether it's performance sport or spaced learning is a more useful distinction. I hope we're going to move that way, but I can't guarantee that's going to happen. Amit may have an answer on that as well.
That's a valuable concept. Going short is a valuable thing. If we know that spacing is going to help in most of the cases in workplace, then I think they tie in very well. And going short, even if we are going under the name of microlearning, I think it's a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Vikas is asking, can small learning pods qualify as microlearning? There is the possibility of a learning objective that's so small that just one learning event, a small one, can achieve it. In my experience, they're relatively rare, and in general, you need to build, and it may atrophy, so it may need reactivation. So yes, small learning pods qualify as microlearning, but as in the spaced learning sense, but I think it's extremely rare that just one learning pod will be sufficient by itself, except in very certain unique circumstances, which are hard to design for and quantify. Bharat asked,
Can I just add to that? I think what you were just sharing, Clark, you've covered that in more detail in the ebook. If anybody is interested, there's a link that Isha has shared in the chat. You may want to download the ebook. It has a little more elaboration on some of the points that Clark talked about today. Just that.
Right. Thanks. Bharat asked, does gamification come under microlearning? Gamification is something you can add to microlearning or to any other learning. It's an independent topic. I'm opinionated about gamification. I think building intrinsic interest through making mini scenarios instead of just multiple choice questions and branching scenarios is really powerful. Points and leaderboards and such, badges to announce accomplishments are not bad, but points and scoreboards, I think the research is now showing that it works for the people who are doing well, but it is actually demotivates folks who are not at the top of the leaderboard. But that's a very complex thing and is a separate issue. Beth Ann mentions that Dr. Pooja Argwal has a lot of applied examples on spaced retrieval practice. Excellent, good pointer. Thank you for that. Barb says typically fewer than 5 minutes. That's a great ideal unless it has to be longer. But again, we tend to overwrite, and it's liable you can possibly do that. Beth Ann asks, doesn't Dr. Thalheimer use surveys a bit for retrieval practice in the book? Those are also good tools. Anything that gets people thinking and responding, whether it's questions or surveys or asking them to reflect on something or to respond to some new information you've given them, are all practical ways to reactivate that learning, which strengthens it, and getting them to respond and retrieve it in the way that they need to retrieve it is useful. Give examples of non-microlearning or microlearning gone wrong. Microlearning gone wrong is easy. People take courses and just break it up into chunks and think that's going to lead to a better outcome than they got with the regular course, which typically is badly designed as well. That's an example of microlearning gone well. Non-microlearning might be, I'm thinking of the CPR practice that's on the iPad that they did in the UK. And you were faced with scenarios and these beautiful video branching scenarios, and you had to respond, and then you even pumped the iPad at the right pace to simulate pressing on the chest. And that to me was not microlearning because it was a deep immersive simulation. And to me, that would be an example of non-microlearning. The spaced learning that pilots do many times is not microlearning either, because they're actually simulating flying and taking off, and a lot of time in the military simulation. So there's times when you need significant skill shifts that you would use spaced learning after some immersive event like that. For anyone wanting to know more, link to the ebook on top of the downloadable doc is there good research on the concepts between micro and spaced learning. Will Thalheimer has actually a good report on spaced learning, on the importance of spaced learning. The diagram that I used to show spaced learning actually was an adaptation of his. And the Nidhi Tundrakar has just did her thesis, her PhD thesis at OISE, Ontario Institute of Studies and Education, on microlearning, particularly for courses. Performance support, there's different research, and it's a lot more based upon expert opinion and usage than it is on analytical research. I've tried to look for it, but there's it's harder to find, but it does exist.
If I can just add,
Sure.
I think the website link that somebody mentioned about Dr. Pooja Agrawal, that has a lot of research listed, and also the book Make It Stick will give you a lot of research.
Yes, Make It Stick summarizes a bunch of the research, and it talks a lot about spaced learning. The thing that's harder to find is the performance support research, but it's out there. But it's I would look to ISPE, International Society for Performance Improvement. What do I think of linking microlearning content with actual courses? Microlearning can act as scaffold for formal learning. In fact, that's what Nidhi's research was having courses and microlearning in between to reactivate, because the courses tend to meet once a week. And so she would have something that would reactivate learning in between that time. There's a lot of evidence that it really needs to be only a few days, at least initially, for that spacing to happen. And if your courses aren't happening with that frequency, you really will want to find some way to provide assignments in between, and microlearning, giving them small things prompting them rather than just giving them assignments is potentially a more powerful lead. She got results from doing that. You're welcome, Raymond. Thank you. Yes, Nidhi Sakdeva. That's the I'm talking about. Okay. Dr. Agarwal did research with Rodinger. Yeah.
She was part of that.
Seminal thinker, indeed. A few other people who've talked about that include Bork, Alfred, and Senior Moment. There's some more, but you absolutely look to her resources. You're welcome, and you're all welcome again. Thank you for attending, and happy to continue to hang out here for a bit longer and answer any more questions. But otherwise, we hope it made sense, and we wish you all the best. Thank you, Beth Ann.
And a quick reminder, please do fill the survey form. It will take you 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you, Clark and Amit, for such a wonderful session. I'm sure some microlearning myths have been busted for good today, and people are going back with some food for thought. And a big thank you to our wonderful interactive audience. You guys were fabulous today. And like Amit just mentioned, I would really request all of you to take a few seconds to fill up the survey that would pop up after the webinar is over. That would help us make our next sessions better. Thank you so much. We will keep the chat open for about 2 more minutes in case you have any parting comments, suggestions.